To him that hath shall be given, says the gospel, representing as a principle of divine justice one that undoubtedly holds in earthly economy. A not dissimilar observation is made in the proverb, possession is 9/10 of the law. Indeed, some trifling acquisition often gives an animal an initial advantage which may easily roll up and increase prodigiously, becoming the basis of prolonged good fortune. Sometimes this initial advantage is a matter of natural structure, like talent, strength, or goodness. Sometimes an accidental accretion, like breeding, instruction, or wealth. Such advantages grow by the opportunities they make, and it is possible for a man launched into the world with the right equipment to mount easily from eminence to eminence and accomplish very great things without doing more than genially follow his instincts and respond with ardor, like an Alexander or a Shakespeare, to his opportunities. A great endowment, doubled by great good fortune, raises men like these into supreme representatives of mankind. It is no loss of liberty to subordinate ourselves to a natural leader. On the contrary, we thereby seize an opportunity to exercise our freedom, availing ourselves of the best instrument obtainable to accomplish our ends. A man may be a natural either by his character or by his position. The advantages a man draws from that peculiar structure of his brain which renders him, for instance, a ready speaker or an ingenious mathematician, are by common consent regarded as legitimate advantages. The public will use and reward such ability without jealousy and with positive delight. In an unsophisticated age, the same feeling prevails in regard to those advantages which a man may draw from more external circumstances. If a traveler, having been shipwrecked in some expedition, should learn the secrets of an unknown land, its arts and resources, his fellow citizens on his return would not hesitate to follow his direction in respect to these novel matters. It would be senseless folly on their part to begrudge him his adventitious eminence and refuse to esteem him of more consequence than their uninitiated selves. Yet when people, ignoring the natural causes of all that is called artificial, think that but for an unlucky chance they, too, might have enjoyed the advantages which raise other men above them, they sometimes affect not to recognize actual distinctions and abilities, or study enviously the means of annulling them. So long, however, as by the operation of any causes whatever some real competence accrues to anyone, it is for the general interest that this competence should bear its natural fruits, diversifying the face of society and giving its possessor a corresponding distinction. Variety in the world is an unmixed blessing, so long as each distinct function can be exercised without hindrance to any other. There is no greater stupidity or meanness than to take uniformity for an ideal, as if it were not a benefit and a joy to a man, being what he is, to know that many are, have been, and will be better than he. Grant that no one is positively degraded by the great man's greatness, and it follows that everyone is exalted by it. Beauty, genius, holiness, even power, and extraordinary wealth radiate their virtue and make the world in which they exist a better and a more joyful place to live in. Hence the insatiable, vulgar curiosity about great people, and the strange way in which the desire for fame, by which the distinguished man sinks to the common level, is met and satisfied by the universal interest in whatever is extraordinary. This avidity not to miss knowledge of things notable, and to enact vicariously all singular roles, shows the need men have of distinction and the advantage they find in conceiving it. For it is the presence of variety and a nearer approach somewhere to just and ideal achievement that gives men perspective in their judgments and opens vistas from the dull foreground of their lives to sea, mountain, and stars. No merely idle curiosity shows itself in this instinct, rather a mark of human potentiality that recognizes in what is yet attained a sad caricature of what is essentially attainable. For man's spirit is intellectual and naturally demands dominion and science. It craves in all things friendliness and beauty. The least hint of attainment in these directions fills it with satisfaction and the sense of realized expectation. So much so that when no inkling of a supreme fulfillment is found in the world or in the heart, men still cling to the notion of it in God or the hope of it in heaven, and religion, when it entertains them with that ideal, seems to have reached its highest height. Love of uniformity would quench the thirst for new outlets, for perfect, even if alien, achievements, and this, so long as perfection had not been actually attained, would indicate a mind dead to the ideal. Menenius Agrippa expressed very well the aristocratic theory of society when he compared the state of a human body in which the common people were the hands and feet, and the nobles the belly. The people, when they forgot the conditions of their own well-being, might accuse themselves of folly and the nobles of insolent idleness. For the people spent their lives in hopeless labor that others who did nothing might enjoy all. But there was a secret circulation of substance in the body politic, and the focusing of all benefits in the few was the cause of nutrition and prosperity to the many. Perhaps the truth might be even better expressed in a physiological figure somewhat more modern by saying that the brain, which consumes much blood, well repays its obligations to the stomach and members, for it coordinates their motions and prepares their satisfactions. Yet there is this important difference between the human body and the state, a difference which renders Agrippa's fable wholly misleading. The hands and feet have no separate consciousness, and if they are ill used, it is the common self that feels the weariness and the bruises. But in the state, the various members have a separate sensibility, and although their ultimate interests lie, no doubt, in cooperation and justice, their immediate instinct and passion may lead them to oppress one another perpetually. At one time, the brain, forgetting the members, may feast on opiates and unceasing music, and again, the members, thinking they could more economically shift for themselves, may starve the brain and reduce the body politic to a colony of vegetating microbes. In a word, the consciousness inhabiting the brain embodies the functions of all the body's organs, and responds in a general way to all their changes of fortune. But in the state, every cell has a separate brain, and the greatest citizen, by his existence, realizes only his own happiness. For an ideal aristocracy, we should not look to Plato's Republic, for that utopia is avowedly the ideal only for fallen and corrupt states, since luxury and injustice, we are told, first necessitated war, and the guiding idea of all the Platonic regimen is military efficiency. Aristocracy finds a more ideal expression in theism, for theism imagines the values of existence to be divided into two unequal parts. On the one hand, the infinite value of God's life, on the other, the infinite values of all the created hierarchy. According to theistic cosmology, there was a metaphysical necessity, if creatures were to exist at all, that they should be in some measure inferior to Godhead. Otherwise, they would have been indistinguishable from the Godhead itself, according to the principle called the identity of indiscernibles. which declares that two beings exactly alike cannot exist without collapsing into an undivided unit. The propagation of life involved then declension from pure vitality, and to diffuse being meant to dilute it with nothingness. This declension might take place in infinite degrees, each retaining some vestige of perfection mixed, as it were, with a greater and greater proportion of impotence and non-entity. Below God stood the angels, below them man, and below man the brute and inanimate creation. Each sphere, as it receded, contained a paler adumbration of the central perfection. Yet even at the last confines of existence, some feeble echo of divinity would still resound. This inequality in dignity would be not only a beauty in the whole, to whose existence and order such inequalities would be essential, but also no evil to the creature and no injustice, for a modicum of good is not made evil simply because a greater good is elsewhere possible. On the contrary, by accepting that appointed place and that specific happiness, each servant of the universal harmony could feel its infinite value and could thrill the more profoundly to a music which he helped to intone. Dante has expressed this thought with great simplicity and beauty. He asks a friend's spirit, which he finds lodged in the lowest circle of paradise, if a desire to mount higher does not sometimes visit him, and the spirit replies, "Brother, the force of charity quiets our will, making us wish only for what we have and thirst for nothing more. If we desired to be in a sublimer sphere, our desires would be discordant with the will of him who here allots us our diverse stations, something which you will see there is no room for in these circles, if to dwell in charity be needful here, and if you consider duly the nature of charity. For it belongs to the essence of that blessed state to keep within the divine purposes, that our own purposes may become one also. Thus the manner in which we are ranged from step to step in this kingdom pleases the whole kingdom, as it does the king who gives us our will to will with him. And his will is our peace. It is that sea toward which all things move, that his will creates and that nature fashions. Such pious resignation has in it something pathetic and constrained, which Dante could not or would not disguise. For a theism which, like Aristotle's and Dante's, has a Platonic essence, God is really nothing but the goal of human aspiration embodied imaginatively. This fact makes these philosophers feel that whatever falls short of divinity has something imperfect about it. God is what man ought to be, and man, while he is still himself, must yearn forever, like Aristotle's cosmos, making in his perpetual round a vain imitation of deity and an eternal prayer. Hence a latent minor strain in Aristotle's philosophy, the hopeless note of paganism, and in Dante an undertone of sorrow and sacrifice, inseparable from Christian feeling. In both, virtue implies a certain sense of defeat, a fatal unnatural limitation, as if a pristine ideal had been surrendered and what remained were at best a compromise. Accordingly, we need not be surprised if aspiration in all these men finally takes a mystical turn. In Dante's ghostly friends, after propounding their aristocratic philosophy to justify God in other men's eyes, are themselves on the point of quitting the lower sphere to which God had assigned them and plunging into the sea of his absolute ecstasy. For if the word God stands for man's spiritual ideal, heaven can consist only in apotheosis. This the Greeks knew very well. They instinctively ignored or feared any immortality which fell short of deification, and the Christian mystics reached the same goal by less overt courses. They merged the popular idea of a personal God in their foretaste of peace and perfection, and their whole religion was an effort to escape humanity. It is true that the theistic cosmology might hear a different interpretation. If by deity we mean not man's ideal, intellectual, or sensuous, but the total cosmic order, then the universal hierarchy may be understood naturalistically, so that each sphere gives scope for one sort of good. God, or the highest being, would then be simply the life of nature as a whole, if nature has a conscious life, or that of its noblest portion. The supposed metaphysical evil involved in finitude would then be no evil at all, but the condition of every good. In realizing his own will in his own way, each creature would be perfectly happy, without yearning or pathetic regrets for other forms of being. Such forms of being would all be unpalatable to him, even if conventionality called higher, because their body was larger and their soul more complex. Nor would divine perfection itself be in any sense perfection unless it gave expression to some definite nature, the entelechy either of the celestial spheres or of scientific thought, or of some other actual existence. Under these circumstances, inhabitants even of the lowest heaven would be unreservedly happy, as happy in their way as those of the seventh heaven could be in theirs. No pathetic note would any longer disquiet their finitude. They would not have to renounce, in sad conformity to an alien will, what even for them would have been a deeper joy. They would be asked to renounce nothing but what, for them, would be an evil. The overruling providence would then in truth be fatherly, by providing for each being that which it inwardly craved. Persons of one rank would not be improved by passing into the so-called higher sphere any more than the ox would be improved by being transformed into a lark, or a king into a poet. Man in such a system could no more pine to be God than he could pine to be the law of gravity, or Spinoza's substance, or Hegel's dialectical idea. Such naturalistic abstractions, while they perhaps express some element of reality or its total form, are not objects corresponding to man's purposes and are morally inferior to his humanity. Every man's ideal lies within the potentialities of his nature, for only by expressing his nature can ideals possess authority or attraction over him. Heaven accordingly has really many mansions, each truly heavenly to him who would inhabit it, and there is really no room for discord in those rounds. One ideal can no more conflict with another than truth can jostle truth. But men, or the disorganized functions within a given individual, may be in physical conflict, as opinion may wrestle with opinion in the world's arena or in an ignorant brain. Among ideals themselves, infinite variety is consistent with perfect harmony. But matter that has not yet developed or discovered its organic affinities may well show groping and contradictory tendencies. When, however, these embryonic disorders are once righted, each possible life knows its natural paradise, and what some unintelligent outsider might say in dispraise of that ideal will never wound or ruffle the self-justified creature whose ideal it is, any more than a cat's aversion to water will disturb a fish's plan of life. An aristocratic society might accordingly be a perfect heaven if the variety and superposition of functions in it expressed a corresponding diversity in its members' faculties and ideals. And indeed, what aristocratic philosophers have always maintained is that men really differ so much in capacity that one is happier for being a slave, another for being a shopkeeper, and a third for being a king. All professions, they say, even the lowest, are or may be vocations. Some men, Aristotle tells us, are slaves by nature. Only physical functions are spontaneous in them. So long as they are humanely treated, it is, we may infer, a benefit for them to be commanded, and the contribution their labor makes toward rational life and their betters is the highest dignity they can attain, and should be prized by them as a sufficient privilege. Such assertions, coming from lordly lips, have a suspicious optimism about them, yet the faithful slave, such as the nurse we find in the tragedies, may sometimes have corresponded to that description. In other regions, it is surely true that to advance in conventional station would often entail a loss in true dignity and happiness. It would seldom benefit a musician to be appointed admiral, or a housemaid to become a prima donna. Scientific breeding might conceivably develop much more sharply the various temperaments and faculties needed in the state, and then each caste or order of citizens would not be more commonly dissatisfied with its lot than men or women now are with their sex. One tribe would run errands as persistently as the ants, another would sing like the lark, a third would show a devil's innate fondness for stroking a fiery furnace. Aristocracy logically involves castes, but such castes as exist in India and the social classes we find in the Western world are not now based on any profound difference in race, capacity, or inclination. They're based probably on the chances of some early war, reinforced by custom and perpetuated by inheritance. A certain circulation, corresponding in part to proved ability or disability, takes place in the body politic. And since the French Revolution has taken place increasingly, some by energy and perseverance, rise from the bottom, some by ill fortune or vice, fall from the top. But these readjustments are insignificant in comparison with the social inertia that perpetuates all the classes. And even such shifts as occur at once reestablish artificial conditions for the next generation. As a rule, men's station determines their occupation without their gifts determining their station. Thus, stifled ability in the lower orders and apathy or pampered incapacity in the higher unite to deprive society of its natural leaders. It would be easy, however, to exaggerate the havoc wrought by such artificial conditions. The monotony we observe in mankind must not be charged to the oppressive influence of circumstances crushing the individual soul. It is not society's fault that most men seem to miss their vocation. Most men have no vocation, and society, in imposing on them some chance language, some chance religion, and some chance career, first plants an ideal in their bosoms and insinuates into them a sort of racial or professional soul. Their only character is composed of the habits they have been led to acquire. Some little propensities betrayed in childhood may very probably survive. One man may prove by his dying words that he was congenitally witty, another tender, another brave. But these native qualities will simply have added an ineffectual tint to some typical existence or other, and the vast majority will remain, as Schopenhauer said, fabrikwaren der nature. Variety in human dreams, like personality among savages, may indeed be inwardly very great, but it is not efficacious. To be socially important and expressible in some common medium, initial differences in temper must be organized into custom and become cumulative by being imitated and enforced. The only artists who can show great originality are those trained in distinct and established schools. For originality and genius must be largely fed and raised on the shoulders of some old tradition. A rich organization and heritage, while they predetermine the core of all possible variations, increase their number, since every advance opens up new vistas in growth, and extending the periphery of the substance organized multiplies the number of points at which new growths may begin. Thus, it is only in recent times that discoveries in science have been frequent, because natural science until lately possessed no settled method and no considerable fund of acquired truths. So, too, in political society, statesmanship is made possible by traditional policies, generalship by military institutions, great financiers by established commerce. If we ventured to generalize these observations, we might say that such an unequal distribution of capacity as might justify aristocracy should be looked for only in civilized states. Savages are born free and equal, but wherever a complex and highly specialized environment limits the loose freedom of those born into it, it also stimulates their capacity. Under forced culture, remarkable growths will appear, bringing to light possibilities in men which might perhaps not even have been possibilities had they been left to themselves. For mulberry leaves do not of themselves develop into brocade. A certain personal idiosyncrasy must be assumed at bottom, else cotton damask would be as good as silk, and all men having like opportunities would be equally great. This idiosyncrasy is brought out by social pressure, while in a state of nature it might have betrayed itself only in trivial and futile ways, as it does among barbarians. Distinction is thus in one sense artificial, since it cannot become important or practical unless a certain environment gives play to individual talent and preserves its originality. But distinction, nevertheless, is perfectly real and not merely imputed. In vain does the man in the street declare that he, too, could have been a king if he had been born in the purple, for that potentiality does not belong to him as he is, but only as he might have been, if, per impossible, he had not been himself. There is a strange metaphysical illusion in imagining that a man might change his parents, his body, his early environment, and yet retain his personality. In its higher faculties, his personality is produced by his special relations. If Shakespeare had been born in Italy, he might, if you will, have been a great poet, but Shakespeare he could never have been. Nor can it be called an injustice to all of us who are not Englishmen of Queen Elizabeth's time that Shakespeare had that advantage and was thereby enabled to exist. The sense of injustice at unequal opportunities rises only when the two environments compared are really somewhat analogous, so that the illusion of a change of roles without a change of characters may retain some color. It was a just insight, for instance, in the Christian fable to make the first rebel against God the chief among the angels, the spirit occupying the position nearest to that which he tried to usurp. Lucifer's fallacy consisted in thinking natural inequality artificial. His perversity lay in rebelling against himself and rejecting the happiness proper to his nature. This was the maddest possible way of rebelling against his true creator, for it is our particular finitude that creates us and makes us be. No one except in willful fancy would envy the peculiar advantages of a whale or an ant, or an Inca or a Grand Lama. An exchange of places with such remote beings would too evidently leave each creature the very same that it was before. For after a nominal exchange of places, each office would remain filled, and no trace of a change would be perceptible. But the penny that one man finds and another misses would not, had fortune been reversed, have transmuted each man into the other. So advantageous a circumstance seems easily transferable without undermining that personal distinction which it had come to embitter. Yet the incipient fallacy, lurking even in such suppositions, becomes obvious when we inquire whether so blind an accident, for instance, as sex, is also adventitious and ideally transferable, and whether Jack and Jill, remaining themselves, could have exchanged genders. What extends these invidious comparisons beyond all tolerable bounds is the generic and vague nature proper to language and its terms. The first personal pronoun I is a concept so thoroughly universal that it can accompany any experience whatever. Yet it is used to designate an individual who is really definable not by his formal selfhood, which he shares with every other thinker, but by the special events that make up his life. Each man's memory embraces a certain field, and if the landscape open to his vision is sad and hateful, he naturally wishes to shift and become like that paradise in which, as he fancies, other men dwell. A legitimate rebellion against evil in his own experience becomes an unthinkable supposition about what his experience might have been had he enjoyed those other men's opportunities, or even, so far can unreason wander, had he possessed their character. The wholly different creature, a replica of that envied ideal, which would have existed in that case, would still have called itself I. And so, the dreamer imagines, that creature would have been himself in a different situation. If a new birth could still be called by a man's own name, the reason would be that the concrete faculties now present in him are the basis for the ideal he throws out. And if these particular faculties came to fruition in a new being, he would call that being himself, inasmuch as it realized his ideal. The poorer the reality, therefore, the meaner and vaguer the ideal it is able to project. Man is so tied to his personal endowment, essential to him though an accident in the world, that even his uttermost ideal, into which he would fly out of himself and his finitude, can be nothing but the fulfillment of his own initial idiosyncrasies. Whatever other wills and other glories may exist in heaven lie not within his universe of aspiration. Even his most perversely metaphysical envy can begrudge to others only what he instinctively craves for himself. It is not merely inequality, therefore, that can be a reproach to the aristocratic or theistic ideal. Could each person fulfill his own nature, the most striking differences in endowment and fortune would trouble nobody's dreams. The true reproach, to which aristocracy and theism are open, is the thwarting of those unequal natures and the consequent suffering imposed on them all. Injustice in this world is not something comparative. The wrong is deep, clear, and absolute in each private fate. A bruised child wailing in the street, his small world for the moment utterly black and cruel before him, does not fetch his unhappiness from sophisticated comparisons or irrational envy, nor can any compensations and celestial harmonies supervening later ever expunge or justify that moment's bitterness. The pain may be whistled away and forgotten. The mind may be rendered by it only a little harder, a little coarser, a little more secretive and sullen and familiar with unrightable wrong. But ignoring that pain will not prevent its having existed. It must remain forever to trouble God's omniscience and be a part of that hell which the creation too truly involves. The same curse of suffering vitiates Agrippa's ingenious parable and the joyful humanity of Dante's celestial friends, and renders both equally irrelevant to human conditions. Nature may arrange her hierarchies as she chooses and make her creatures instrumental to one another's life. That interrelation is no injury to any part and an added beauty in the whole. It would have been a truly admirable arrangement to have enabled every living being, in attaining its own end, to make the attainments of others' ends possible to them also. An approach to such an equilibrium has actually been reached in some respects by the rough sifting of miscellaneous organisms until those that were compatible alone remained. But nature, in her haste to be fertile, wants to produce everything at once, and her distracted industry has brought about terrible confusion and waste and terrible injustice. She has been led to punish her ministers for the services they render, and her favorites for the honors they receive. She has imposed suffering on her creatures together with life. She has defeated her own objects and vitiated her bounty by letting every good do harm and bring evil in its train to some unsuspecting creature. This oppression is the moral stain that attaches to aristocracy and makes it truly unjust. Every privilege that imposes suffering involves a wrong. Not only does aristocracy lay on the world a tax and labor and privation that its own splendors, intellectual and worldly, may arise, but by so doing it infects intelligence and grandeur with inhumanity and renders corrupt and odious that preeminence which should have been divine. The lower classes, in submitting to the hardship and meanness of their lives, which to be sure might have been harder and meaner had no aristocracy existed, must upbraid their fellow men for profiting by their ill fortune, and therefore having an interest in perpetuating it. Instead of the brutal but innocent injustice of nature, what they suffer from is the sly injustice of men. And though the suffering be less for the worst of men, what they suffer from is the sly injustice of men. And though the suffering be less, for the worst of men is human, the injury is more sensible. The inclemencies and dangers men must endure in a savage state, in scourging them, would not have profited by that cruelty. But suffering has an added sting when it enables others to be exempt from care and to live like the gods in irresponsible ease. The inequality which would have been innocent and even beautiful in a happy world becomes, in a painful world, a bitter wrong, or at best, a criminal beauty. It would be a happy relief to the aristocrat's conscience, when he possesses one, could he learn from some yet bolder Descartes that common people were nothing but petite machines, and that only a groundless prejudice had hitherto led us to suppose that life could exist where evidently nothing good could be attained by living. If all unfortunate people could be proved to be unconscious, automa, what a brilliant justification that would be for for the ways of both God and men. Philosophy would not lack arguments to support such an agreeable conclusion, beginning with the axiom that whatever is right. A metaphysician might adduce the truth that consciousness is something self-existent and indubitably real. Therefore, he would contend it must be self-justifying and indubitably good. And he might continue by saying that a slave's life was not its own excuse for being, nor were the labors of a million drudges otherwise justified than by the conveniences which they supplied their masters with. Ergo, those servile operations could come to consciousness only where they attained their end, and the world could contain nothing but perfect and universal happiness. A divine omniscience and joy shared by finite minds, insofar as they might attain perfection, would be the only life in existence, and the notion that such a thing as pain, sorrow, or hatred could exist at all would forthwith vanish like the hideous and ridiculous illusion that it was. This argument may be recommended to apologetic writers as no weaker than those they commonly rely on, and infinitely more consoling. But so long as people remain on what such an invaluable optimist might call the low level of sensuous thought, and so long as we imagine that we exist and suffer, an aristocratic regimen can only be justified by radiating benefit and by proving that were less given to those above, less would be attained by those beneath them. Such reversion of benefit might take a material form, as when, by commercial guidance and military protection, a greater net product is secured to labor, even after all needful taxes have been levied upon it to support greatness. An industrial and political oligarchy might defend itself on that ground, or the return might take the less positive form of opportunity, as it does when an aristocratic society has a democratic government. Here the people neither accept guidance nor require protection, but the existence of a rich and irresponsible class offers them an ideal, such as it is, in their ambitious struggles, for they too may grow rich, exercise financial ascendancy, educate their sons like gentlemen, and launch their daughters into fashionable society. Finally, if the only aristocracy recognized were an aristocracy of achievement, and if public rewards followed personal merit, the reversion to the people might take the form of participation by them in the ideal interest of eminent men. Holiness, genius, and knowledge can reverberate through all society. The fruits of art and science are in themselves cheap and not to be monopolized or consumed in enjoyment. On the contrary, their wider diffusion stimulates their growth and makes their cultivation more intense and successful. When an ideal interest is general, the share which falls to the private person is the more apt to be efficacious. The saints have usually had companions, and artists and philosophers have flourished in schools. At the same time, ideal goods cannot be assimilated without some training and leisure. Like education and religion, they are degraded by popularity and reduced from what the master intended to what the people are able and willing to receive. So pleasing an ideal, then, as this of diffused ideal possessions has little application in a society aristocratically framed. For the greater eminence the few attain, the less able are the many to follow them. Great thoughts require a great mind, and pure beauties a profound sensibility. To attempt to give such things a wide currency is to be willing to denaturalize them in order to boast that they have been propagated. Culture is on the horns of this dilemma. If profound and noble, it must remain rare. If common, it must become mean. These alternatives can never be eluded until some purified and high-bred race succeeds the promiscuous bipeds that now blacken the planet. Aristocracy, like everything else, has no practical force save that which mechanical causes endow it with. Its privileges are fruits of inevitable advantages. Its oppressions are simply new forms and vehicles for nature's primeval cruelty, while the benefits it may also confer are only further examples of her nice equilibrium and necessary harmony. For it lies in the essence of a mechanical world, where the interests of its products are concerned, to be fundamentally kind, since it has formed and, on the whole, maintains those products, and yet continually cruel, since it forms and maintains them blindly, without considering difficulties or probable failures. Now, the most tyrannical government, like the best, is a natural product maintained by an equilibrium of natural forces. It is simply a new mode of mechanical energy to which the philosopher, living under it, must adjust himself as he would to the weather. But when the vehicle of nature's inclemency is a heartless man, even if the harm done be less, it puts on a new and immoral aspect. The source of injury is then not only natural but criminal as well, and the result is a sense of wrong added to misfortune. It must needs be that offense come, but woe to him to whom the offense cometh. He justly arouses indignation and endures remorse. Now, civilization cannot afford to entangle its ideals with the causes of remorse and of just indignation. In the first place, nature, in her slow and ponderous way, levels her processes and rubs off her sharp edges by perpetual friction. Where there is maladjustment, there is no permanent physical stability. Therefore, the ideal of society can never involve the infliction of injury on anybody for any purpose. Such an ideal would propose for a goal something out of equilibrium, a society which, even if established, could not maintain itself. But an ideal life must not tend to destroy its ideal by abolishing its own existence. In the second place, it is impossible on moral grounds that injustice should subsist in the ideal. The ideal means the perfect, and a supposed ideal in which wrong still subsisted would be the denial of perfection. The ideal state and the ideal universe should be a family where all are not equal, but where all are happy, so that an aristocratic or theistic system, in order to deserve respect, must discard its sinister apologies for evil and clearly propose such an order of existences, one supposed upon the other, as should involve no suffering on any of its levels. The services required of each must involve no injury to any. To perform them should be made the servant's spontaneous and specific ideal. The privileges the system bestows on some must involve no outrage on the rest, and must not be paid for by mutilating other lives or thwarting their natural potentialities. For the humble to give their labor would then be blessed in reality, and not merely by imputation, while for the great to receive those benefits would be blessed also, not in fact only, but in justice.